And there are quite a few colourings of the photographs that would have come out of it, and paintings which are very, very beautiful. This is a shot of the southern half of the Newmar Channel, so of Vinke Island. This mountain here is Luigi Mountain. It's in the backdrop of Lochroy. I know we have low clouds at the moment, but the mountain range itself, the Sierra du Fif. Mount Luigi has got 7 smaller peaks to the right, if you're looking at it from here, which all run in one perfect ridge. So Mount Luigi does have a nickname that you might see in some guidebooks, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And this is the area. Again, we have Mount William right here, Port Lochroy in this area right here, and this is the Belgica anchored in front of Mount William, so in the vicinity of where we are right at this moment. They did continue south afterwards, and they came into Hidden Bay here. I mentioned Cape Renard as we were in the Le Maire yesterday, and Wandel Island, later renamed or reclassified as Booth Island. Hovgard, this is Peterman Island, depicted a little larger than it is, but however it was the first charts of the area, accurate charts. So he named the Le Maire Channel after Charles Le Maire, who was a Belgian explorer of the African Congo, not after Jacob Le Maire, the first man to round the Horn, but Charles Le Maire, a Belgian explorer. And this is Cape Renard, a photograph from Cook. So on the right of here would be the northern entrance to the Le Maire, and a photograph that I took a little earlier in the season. As they were exiting the Le Maire, they'd already accomplished quite a lot. They had discovered the Gerlache Strait, which is the main waterway of the peninsula, the northern part of the peninsula. It separates the Palmer archipelago from the mainland. And they'd spent a week on shore, the first land exploration in the Antarctic, and they'd made 20 landings by this point as well. They'd also obliterated pre-existing charts, and they'd sailed over where land was charted, and they'd landed where water was charted. Despite that, the Gerlache wanted to continue. They'd had lots of delays, but he wanted to press south and continued into the Grand Didier Channel, where he saw a vast bay or a strait. Ice closed around the ship several times during this transit south, but he was very competent, and he was very unconcerned, I should say, due to his engine power and his sail power, that he could negotiate his way through and out of it and continue. So he worked his way out a number of times, continued south, and on February 15th, they saw a star for the very first time since leaving Terra del Fuego. Lecointe was able to use the star to accurately fix their position. He had been navigating using just dead reckoning up until this point. He had an inkling that they were very close to the Antarctic Circle by this point, and that this star confirmed it. And that night they crossed the Antarctic Circle into where we were just a few days ago. Despite the continued excitement of the voyage, especially after getting that far south and sighting Alexander the First Island, remember that island? Some of the crew were expressing concerns that autumn was approaching a little bit too fast. The arrival of the stars started to confirm this, and later that night, on February 16th, they lost sight of Alexander the First land as they continued south, and that would be the last time they would see land for 13 months. So, from February the 17th, which is up here somewhere, until February 29th, all the Gerlache could do is just trend west along an ice edge. The ice was very, very thick. Several times the ship got caught, and on one particular occasion, the Gerlache got all of his crew together, all of his men together, and asked them how they would feel about spending the winter trapped in the ice. For science, of course. Everyone expressed reservations at this, as you might expect. No one, I need to reiterate, no one had ever spent a winter in Antarctica, ever, on land, on a ship or anything. This is before the expeditions I've been talking about. We're going promised his men that he would turn around and head for Ushuaia via the peninsula again and the South Shetlands. However, 4 days later, he about-faced again and started to push his way south into this field of ice. This slide is a beautiful slide. I put some coordinates at the bottom, and these coordinates denote the point at which they lost complete control of the ship and it became totally and utterly beset in the ice. Nothing more they could do. This photograph's actually taken from months later during midwinter, a photograph by Cook, taken in August, I believe. Sorry, no, March, actually. March 4th. He used nothing. No, it's August, sorry, I'm being stupid. He used nothing but moonlight to take this. It was pitch black, there was no light apart from the moonlight, and he had to use a 60-minute exposure to capture this image. So an hour exposure. You might remember from my recaps, you've got Alexander the First Island. We were in Marguerite Bay, just about here, off the screen. This is where they became beset, so a long way from land. When they became beset, a big, large floe froze around the ship, so encased the ship. So the ship was safe. It was not in a position such as the Endurance was, where they had 3 different floes coming in different angles. They were safely encased, but had weather come in and broken this floe up, then they would be at the mercy of hundreds of thousands of tons of ice. All the men knew, they were terrified in fact, but they all knew that if the ship was lost, it would be a death sentence. They didn't feel equipped to make an overland journey or a journey across the ice. The nearest land that was known to them was well over 300 miles away on a moving platform. So they were pretty terrified. Here it is again, just where they are. So we're in the Marguerite Bay area. Stonington's just about there. Obviously, at this point, the mood was pretty grim. The Gerlache was the only positive one. He wrote, we were about to spend the first winter in the Antarctic pack, and this fact alone promised plenty of scientific data to collect and plenty of opportunity for study. Was this not what we had asked for? Eventually, the men adopted the same mindset as the Gerlache, and the mood lifted and they started getting out and about on the ice for observations, and here are the men taking underwater temperatures. The first weeks of the expedition, trapped in the ice, just before winter fell, were the happiest times they were to have. These men on board watched the calendar extremely closely. They made sure that they celebrated for every single possible reason that they could, all legal holidays from any country, every birthday possible, obviously their own, but anyone else of note, whether it was a famous musician or favourite musician, or family members or friends. And even in April, Amundsen, Lecointe and Venza organised a beauty contest where they would take magazine clippings of women and just organise this exceptionally complex beauty contest where they couldn't even vote for several days because they were still explaining the rules to the rest of the crew. There were eventually 464 entrants to the beauty contest, and after weeks and weeks of tallying and voting, they got down to 2 finalists that were, of course, to them the most beautiful women in the world. But things started to get colder and damper. On board, Lecointe was now regularly using the stars to fix their daily position, and on the 16th of May, the sun was getting so low that it rose and set for the very last time. If their latitude was to stay the same, had they not drifted north or south, they would not see the sun for 70 days. So you can imagine now on board it's becoming perpetually cold and always damp, and they're huddled together in this old ship, and they struggle to communicate amongst themselves. And remember that man who stuck his hand up and said he could cook, food became a problem very, very quickly. Many had developed already a distaste for canned meats, so they started to try penguin, and this is how Frederick Cook describes it. If it's possible to imagine a piece of beef, odoriferous codfish, and a canvas-backed duck roasted together in a pot with blood and cod liver oil as sauce, the illustration would be complete. So the problem wasn't the food, actually. It wasn't the fact that they couldn't hunt the food. They could hunt the food. They could hunt seal and penguin quite easily. It was having an incompetent chef. And most men refused to eat the seal or the penguin as prepared by Michot, the steward and cook. And scurvy started to make an appearance. Okay, so as the light faded, all of the men started to become more and more lethargic, and overall, Cook had started to notice that something was affecting all of them, but couldn't quite put his finger on it. There were signs of scurvy, but there are other maladies. Essentially, I think what bothered a lot of them, they got nighttime or darkness-induced depression that we're familiar with now, especially me, coming from England. They didn't really understand it at the time, so Cook termed it polar anemia. They had heart murmurings, some had shortness of breath, they were all depressed, combined with signs of scurvy. He didn't quite know what it was, so polar anemia was the name he gave it. He was concerned for all the men, but there was one man in particular, the Galash's close friend, Emil Danko, he was most concerned about. He had been complaining about shortness of breath before the sun disappeared, but on June 1st, he eventually took to his bunk and he stopped eating, and on June 5th, just a few days later, he died. So that was 2 deaths. And Arctowski writes, and this is a photograph from Cook, in the obscurity of the midday twilight, we carried Lieutenant Danko's body to a hole which had been cut in the ice and committed it to the deep. A bitter wind was blowing over our bare heads. Each of us silent, we left him there, and the flow drifted on. So now they're down from 19 to 17 on an already undermanned craft. And the scurvy plus the polar night-induced depression carried on and really, really set in after that death. Cook became concerned as the men became increasingly despondent, and in late June their cat died as well, just to add to the toll. Moral leadership fell to Cook. De Gerlache and LeCointe had both taken to their bunks sick, so overall command fell to the ranking officer Amundsen, but Cook was the man who took over the moral leadership of the group. And he really saved a lot of men's lives. He changed their diets completely. He would take each man, strip them naked and set them in front of a fire for 2 hours each, feed them cranberry sauce, feed them milk, and ensure that they ate fresh seal and penguin meat. So he would even cook for them, and he would try and boost their morale, and he saved many men. He worked at fixing LeCointe first, so he could resume his duties, and he had him up out of his bunk on his feet, working again within 1 week. So his remedies worked. The crew recuperated one after the other and started to get outside and about as the sun returned a couple months later. They started to accomplish some sledging around. They didn't really get far. The weather plagued them pretty heavily. August particularly was a very, very stormy month, and they were shrouded in fog much of the time. It also brought them the coldest temperatures that they would experience in the whole expedition, -45 Fahrenheit. And you can see them bundled up for these temperatures. Despite the bad weather, wildlife started to return. This boosted the men further, but at the same time, as this sickness started to creep back into the men as well. So moods were simmering, but they were depressing eventually. De Gerlache wanted to keep the men busy, so he ordered the men to overhaul the engine, despite not needing it. That was in September. They had their minds on things. And also, the men started to experiment with tonite, which was supposedly more effective than dynamite on ice. They carried dynamite to break ice. Ice is extremely plastic, and it doesn't work, any explosive doesn't work very well in ice at all. However, it kept them busy and boosted morale. When the new year came around, so here's the 31st of December, as the new year came around, they were still stuck in the ice, and everyone started to feel desperate. So New Year, January, the height of summer, they really expected or hoped to be able to free themselves by that point. And the men started digging big troughs to let seawater rush in over the ice and let nature aid nature in breaking up the sea ice. That didn't work, it just refroze at night. So they started cutting deep channels in the ice from the stern of the ship to the nearest lead, or from the bow of the ship to the nearest lead. Sometimes it took them 3 weeks to accomplish some of these 3,000, 4,000 feet cutting ice continuously. This was still in January. But in mid-February, they were able to start manoeuvring the ship into some natural leads in the ice, and took again a little bit of control of the vessel and started to thread their way through some of these leads. And here is when they resumed control, and they started to follow these leads right into mid-March. So from mid-February to mid-March, 1 month, negotiating these very narrow leads, getting eventually to this ice edge and working its way out. And she was freed after about 13 months imprisonment. During the earlier stages of that year, when they started to get out on the ice again, the Gerlache had ideas about continuing to Victoria Land in the Ross Sea area, but after that near scrape, getting trapped again for a second winter, which they all had accepted they wouldn't survive, no one had to persuade him to return north after they did get free. So this was their simplified track. He sailed immediately to Punta Arenas. The men, of course, once they arrived, they rushed ashore as soon as she was secure in the port. The expedition achieved much scientifically, both for about 3 weeks in the peninsular region where we are now, and they obliterated all the charts in the region, but also their first winter, it really opened the door to the heroic age. They took, obviously the meteorological work during that winter was extremely significant, as no one had been down here. Why do I call it the heroic, a heroic contribution? Well, as I said, it's opening the door, it inaugurated the heroic age of exploration, i.e. men coming down and being able to penetrate the interior of Antarctica by overwintering. Once you have a group of men survive and overwinter, other men would follow. It also achieved one additional result. It introduced, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, Roald Amundsen to the Antarctic. Amundsen would later go on to lead the first expedition to reach the South Pole, 1910 and 1912, his expedition on the Fram. He would also be the only man from the Belgica expedition to return to Antarctica. De Gerlache had joined Charcot for his first expedition on the Francais, but he got off as they were headed south. He claimed to the world, a press release, that he just missed his new fiancée, but secretly de Gerlache harboured some concerns over Charcot's lack of planning and also that unreliable engine that he had to buy due to lack of funds. So Cook was the only one to return. He also was the first man to sail the Northwest Passage. What about the ship itself? The Belgica here in front of Mount William, where we are. It was taken into the Arctic for 3 expeditions under de Gerlache. It was then sold to Norwegians to service that Spitsbergen and Svalbard coal mining industry. During World War II, it was anchored off of Harstad in Norway. The 2 masts were cut from the back, and some of this was stripped off as well, and it was used by the British Army as a munitions supply And during a raid on German-occupied Norway, when the British troops were being evacuated, a U-boat was in the area and one of the torpedoes exploded nearby the vessel and damaged the hull very, very slightly, but enough to let lots and lots of water in. And she was discovered in the mid-90s, lying off the coast of Norway, off Brøvika, near Harstad, just 20 metres of water. And here are some divers. They actually took scientific measurements of the vessel, of the design of the vessel, and a replica is currently being finished off in Belgium as we speak. There are also plans to raise this ship as a museum ship, so we can all go and visit and enjoy the history that she offers. That is the end of my talk. Thank you very much.